So in this video, like I alluded to in the last video, we're going to talk about how monetary policy and the Fed's changing monetary policy is going to affect the money supply, and how that money supply is going to change, or that change in the money supply is actually going to change the money market equilibrium. So, but before we get into that too far, let's recap. Let's talk about that money supply real quick. First and foremost, we have a monetary policy, that affects the money supply. So that's where we talked about where the Fed is going to change the amount of buying, or the order of the buying and selling of the government securities. That's where they're going to be dealing with changing the discount rate and changing the required reserve ratio. So we have a monetary policy that affects the money supply. We have a demand for money, and how much are people going to be holding in cash or checkable deposits. We have this demand for money, and this demand is a function of interest, or the sensitivity to that interest, and a function of that national income, and that the equilibrium of the demand and the supply of money are going to be used to determine the interest rate. So how does the monetary policy then affect the equilibrium of money and the interest rate? We know that it's going to affect it, but how does it do it? So, first and foremost, we have this perfectly vertical money supply. So what does that mean? What does that money supply, vertical money supply mean? It means that we have a constant money supply. That basically the Fed comes in and determines this is what the money supply is going to be, and then that equilibrium will then determine the interest rate. So, but we also know that the Fed can increase the money supply. So what happens if they shift that money supply to the right? Well, first off, how are they going to shift that money supply to the right? How are we going to have a larger money supply? This is the expansionary policy. They are actually expanding the money supply. And here we have the money supply is growing. That's that expansionary policy. So what are they doing in order to get that to happen? Well, they're lowering the required reserve. If we lower the required reserve, banks can now loan are not required to keep as much in reserves. They loan out more, and then that'll expand the money supply. Or they're lowering the discount rate, encouraging banks to borrow more or to loan out more and get closer to running close to those of not really having any excess reserves. Or they're going to be buying those government securities, placing money back into the checkable deposits, expanding the money supply. So it's expanding the money supply, or that money supply is growing. And whenever that money supply grows, it actually shifts that money supply to the right. So what happens when we expand the money supply, we shift it to the right? Well, whenever that money supply is shifted to the right, we actually have a movement along the market, or the money demand curve. That it moves down the money demand curve. We have a shift in the market, or in the money supply, but a movement along that demand curve. So it moves it down to where now our equilibrium is right here. It's at this lower part. And we see that the quantity of money is increased. Well, that makes sense. We've taken expansionary money supply, our expansionary policies for that money. We have more money in the economy. That quantity of money is increased. But the interest rate is also fallen, because we now have more money, that banks are now trying to loan out more money. They're actually going to be doing that at a lower interest rate. So the equilibrium interest rate, or that interest rate, has actually fallen now. So anytime we expand the money supply, and we shift that money supply to the right, we are actually going to have more money to loan out, and that's actually lowering the interest rate. We have more money that people are going to keep in cash and on hand. And our quantity of money, or equilibrium quantity of money, is increased, and our interest rate has fallen. But what happens if they shift the money supply to the left? What if we take on these contractionary policies? What if the money supply is falling? What if we have less of that money supply in the United States, and we're over here at this money supply right here? What if we raise the required reserve? What if we raise the discount rate? What if we're selling the government securities in order to have these contractionary policies? Well, simple enough. We have less money in the economy, So the quantity of money, the quantity that we're going to keep in cash, it is now less. It's decreased. But at the same rate, or same token, banks now have less money to loan out. So they're actually going to be raising the interest rates. So the interest rates actually go up as we enact these contractionary policies. So just kind of as a recap, how does this monetary policy affect the equilibrium of money? Anytime we engage in expansionary policies, we're shifting that money supply curve to the right. That money supply curve is actually going to put more money in the economy, and it's going to decrease interest rates. If we get into this contractionary policies, the money supply is actually falling, and it's actually going to raise interest rates. And that's actually how our money supply, our monetary policy, is going to affect the equilibrium of money and the interest rates.